This unit, we're going to cover pasture management, and this topic is very important to understand as it can be a component of our horse's nutrition. It's also a component of, to an extent, their enrichment behavior, right? Allowing them to utilize these natural foraging behaviors. And so managing pasture to allow horses to have access to this is going to be critical in giving them the nutrition they need and allowing them to be out and roaming around and foraging. So when we look at pasture management, there's a few considerations we need to make. Soil, feeding, weed control, grazing management, fertilization, the species we have, especially related to toxic or poisonous plants. And so to start, I want to go over some of the basics of our horses grazing. And the first thing I want to hit on is how frequently our horses are grazing a day. And it's going to be at least 13 hours, but often up to 18 hours. I've seen some estimates be even higher than that of closer to 20 hours. And so it does take up a huge part of the day for horses who are allowed pasture access. This is important because pasture does have a large moisture component, so they do need to consume a higher amount of grass in order to get the nutrients that they need. Some other things about horses that make them unique grazers is they are top grazers, meaning they only like to eat the highly preferred areas, which is often the top of the plants where we might see that higher NSC or those seed heads and the lower fiber. We also see them as spot grazers. So with parasites, we kind of talked about the roughs and the lawns and how they are very selective about where they're eating. And so our horses tend to avoid areas with manure when they're given that opportunity. They might eat close to the root system. I know that's a little contradictory to the top grazing component, but it kind of depends on what the horse has access to. So a horse who might have the ability to choose, they're often top grazers, but unlike some other livestock, horses do have the ability to be more intensive grazers. They bite with their incisors compared to like cows who kind of use their tongue for a decent amount of getting that grass. And because they kind of clip with their teeth, they can get very close. They can more intensively graze pasture when they need to. We also see pasture having the ability to be compounded by trampling damage. So our horse has that one kind of pie pan shaped hoof, and it can cause ruts and divots and damage the plants. Primarily when we see that soil being more wet or muddy, it can create issues. But overall, our horses are intensive and extensive grazers, and so it is important for us to manage the pasture properly. So what are some typical problems that we see when managing our pastures? I would say the number one problem I see is overstocking or overgrazing. So I had mentioned that the stocking rate should be 2 acres for every horse, and I have very rarely seen that in my times traveling to different farms of people who use the proper management and stocking rate. The issue with this is when there's too many horses for the land, the horses will overgraze. And when you think of it, when what's above ground tends to be pretty representative of what's below ground. So the shorter the grass above ground, the shorter the roots. They don't have the energy they need to kind of develop. And so it's not going to be a very healthy plant. In comparison, the more that plant is allowed to grow, the taller it is, the more extensive of a root system they likely have, which makes it more better at taking up moisture, getting nutrients. So making sure that we do the correct stocking rate is a huge practice that we need to be considering. Another thing I see is going to be excess manure or improper management of that manure. And we will talk about that as well, but let's say improper management. But horses are grazing out on pasture, and it's tricky to collect all that manure out of pasture. It's the larger the pasture you have, you're not necessarily bringing a wheelbarrow around or driving around and picking up poop over 10 acres. But that can pose issues, especially in terms of parasite management, but even just horses being selective over the areas they're eating. If I had to pick an ideal situation, all that manure would be collected 1 to 2 times a week, put into a compost pile, composted, and then reapplied to that pasture. I did a study looking at different fertilizers, and we did find that horses just did not want to eat in the areas they defecated. The things I found what I found was most interesting is we looked at the treatments a year later, and when we did that, we looked at preference for the pasture, the treatments, and even a year, I couldn't even tell which treatments were which. I was like digging around looking for the flags we put to mark the plots, and the horses still avoided those manure plots. And so that shows that having that extra manure, it's a long-term issue where the horses do tend to avoid it, likely due to that smell of the manure. Some other things we can see is poor drainage. So water pooling up in pastures or collecting in certain areas, it becoming muddy. There are ways to get around that. And then I would say the other biggest issue I see is with soil health and nutrients. And so ultimately, the soil is going to be what supplies the nutrients to your plants. And many people just think that the soil can just self-sustain, and it can't. It needs assistance. We take a lot out of it through grazing and through using these pastures. So we need to put that back into it as well. And so quickly to just highlight the pros and cons of pasture. So some pros that we see with pasture is that it is a way to more naturally meet nutritional needs. So we use it in place of hay. In comparison to hay, we can meet vitamin A and E requirements from pasture. It'll depend on the pasture whether or not we can meet all micromineral requirements. So a ration balancer may still be needed, but we're closer to meeting those nutritional needs and requirements of the horse when they're on pasture. It also offers natural exercise, which I would also say is a form of enrichment. It's more exciting for the horse to be out and exhibiting these natural behaviors. It gets them moving. It is really a great opportunity for them to be out in these larger spaces. And then I'm going to put cost in here is that I used to believe, having a pasture is going to be cheap because I'm not buying hay. That was before I started fertilizing and mowing and managing it properly. It's not, I would say it's probably more affordable to have pasture, and considering it meets most of the nutritional needs, I might be saving on providing them extra grain. However, the cost of fertilizer, depending on what you need to do, or mowing, or just herbicides, managing it, it's not necessarily cheap. So cost, take that with a grain of salt. It depends on what you have to do with your pasture. The cons to it is that I'm just going to put in the variability of the pasture. And to give you a reference of what I'm kind of referring to, but horses with metabolic or health problems that require a set level of nutrients to make sure that they stay healthy. So like our metabolic horses need lower non-structural carbohydrates, and pasture is going to change. It's going to change by the minute, by the hour, and by the day, right? So you can't really predict what nutrients that you're going to be offering the horse. And so that's definitely difficult for horses who are special needs, and giving them a hay that I can keep consistent tends to be an easier management practice to use. And another thing is that it's going to require more time to manage. So hay for us, we feed round bales. We have 2 horses and a pony, and we put out a round bale about once a month for them, and that's all they need. I mean, that's in the winter. In the summer, now they're out on pasture, and we have about 3 acres of pasture for them, and we're rotationally grazing it. And every time after we rotationally graze, we're mowing it. I have to put fertilizer down twice a year. I try to avoid spraying herbicides, but sometimes we do that as well. Sometimes I'm out there just digging up weeds out of the pasture. And so it does take more time to manage. And, mowing an acre takes me at least an hour. And so to do it well, it's going to take you some time, and that is something to be considering. But that's kind of the basics of our pastures and some things we're going to dive a little deeper into in this unit.